Hi, everybody. I'm Ken Jaffe. I'm going to be talking to you about my experience with Slope Farms, and I welcome you to interrupt me and ask questions and tell me when I'm wrong. Um, so, so we've been raising grass-fed beef and marketing grass-fed beef for over 20 years. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience with the industry and how we did this, and then some of the findings and the aspects of thinking about how to finish at a profit. Um, we started farming in Meredith. We had about 100 acres of pasture, and then we leased another 75 or so. We always bought our hay rather than manufactured it. Um, we mostly marketed, or eventually almost only marketed, to wholesale customers, which were retail stores, butcher shops, restaurants, and mostly down in the New York metro area and some upstate also, but mostly downstate because that's where most of the demand was. Um, when we started, we thought that grass-fed beef would scale a lot more in New York State, that it would become a bigger part of the industry because, a bigger part of the ag industry in New York, because New York has so much pasture, very productive pasture, a lot of rainfall, a lot of unused pasture, according to uh, uh, Peter Bachman, his last name, at Cornell. He studied unused pasture. There's 1 million acres of unused pasture in New York State, in addition to the utilized pasture. And there's a huge demand. There's about 1 million beef animals being eaten in New York City every year. But it did grow, but it didn't really scale up the way I anticipated. Um, so there are a number of reasons for this. There was, trouble with just maintaining an inventory of consistently finished animals. Commodity people were often not willing to pay the extra price for grass-fed, although interestingly, now that commodity beef has become so expensive, the spread between commodity beef and grass-fed has narrowed quite a bit. There are problems with access to processing, and the cost of processing in New York State is, because the processors are small and kind of artisanal, and that they cut every animal kind of differently. There's not a mass production like there is at the big slaughterhouses in Pennsylvania. So the price added to the finished product can be about $2 a pound, which when you're dealing with ground beef, definitely gets people's attention, the consumer's attention. Um, and then when there were attempts there were several different waves of well-financed aggregators, and they they the ones that there were three waves that all failed ultimately because they had the problems with all these problems, finishing, price competition, and ultimately they couldn't move all the ground beef. So they ended up with, many thousands of pounds of frozen ground beef, which they needed to be able to sell in order to make the whole model work. And, consumers were unfamiliar with grass-fed beef. It requires a little bit different cooking technique. It actually tastes like something, as opposed to commodity beef, which is pretty bland by comparison. So well, we scaled up to a point, and then we were pretty steady in terms of the size of our business. Our business model was to really have a reliable wholesale supply, or be able to supply wholesale buyers reliably. We sell half and whole animals, and we've worked to find customers who are buying on a regular basis. So they want consistent flow, a rhythm, and quality. There may be some variation based on seasonality, but we know what they're expecting, and they know what they're expecting from us, and that sort of worked out over the years. The consistent quality is really critical. I think the buyers, the butchers and the restaurants, they understand there's some seasonal variability, but they still need a kind of a consistent quality of finish on the animals. I mean, I found that there's a limited number of buyers who want whole animals on a regular basis. I tip my hat to people who are able to make it in the freezer trade. That's not something that I was ever able to really do. Um, Although I think that until you get to a certain scale, there are economies of scale on the farm that, if you crunch the numbers, you need to get over certain numbers in order to make the whole system work. I'm happy to be proven wrong about that, but that's just my sense of it. So we started working when we first were getting going and we got requests for more grass-fed beef and we didn't have enough animals. We started working with other producers because it was like, somebody calls up, they want grass-fed beef, and my current inventory is all committed, so I could say, sure, I'll have it for you in 3 years. But that was not what they wanted. So I started working with other producers who followed the same model, which was only grass, no added hormones, no antibiotics, and then was able to develop relationships with other farmers by by in a way, doing risk management. So I would make a commitment to a number of animals and over a time frame and what the price would be so people would know what they were going to be, that they were going to be able to sell what they were producing. And over time, I've been working with a lot of the same producers, with some variation, but a lot of the same producers for, like 15 years now. So, long-term relationships with good communication and 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 understanding that things are not always perfect. So for me, it was like there was a learning curve here because I didn't come from a farming background. I spent a lot of time learning the production on farm, rotational grazing, spent a lot of time in the slaughterhouse looking at carcasses on the rail pretty much every week for, several years. So I would be able to see what the carcasses look like and what the ribeyes look like compared to what I was seeing in the field and then be talking to the end user who was a chef or a restaurant person or a retailer and get their feedback from their cooking experience with the beef and their customer who were who were purchasing it and made adjustments based on that and understood what they needed in terms of consistency and finish in order to keep the flow going and learning to really speak the language of the farmers, the processors, and the chefs, or at least maybe not be fluent, but at least have conversational language in all three. Um, so, in terms of finishing, I mean, genetics are hugely important. Um, I would say that now there's a lot access. I mean, not it's still a lot of problem getting access to good genetics, but compared to 2003, it's way easier. We mostly worked with the British breeds, mostly with Angus and Hereford. I'm not saying there aren't other good breeds that do well on grass, but that's my experience of what worked best in our climate, cold winters in particular, and cooler summers also, relatively speaking. Um, the it's slow. If you're trying to just sort of start from the beginning, I would say it was easier for me to learn the pasture, do rotational grazing, and maintain the pasture properly than it was to get the genetics right. Because, it's 3 years after you make a breeding decision that you have a carcass to look at. And that's slow. I mean, if you're making adjustments, you could see it can be kind of almost like a generational thing before you actually have gotten your herd right. So I would encourage people to, it says here, see breeding stock, but what I meant was seek breeding stock from successful finishers, because they've already done the work and made the mistakes and made the adjustments to have good animals. So there's a lot of marketing of genetics and people making claims based on, storylines from other countries, and may be true, but I think I would really opt to be seeking people with farms that have consistently produced well-finished grass-fed beef in our location, our region. And I never used EPDs. I'm not sure how well they work in this context. I'm personally always a little skeptical of self-reported data. Maybe that's sort of too cynical, but and maybe there is better EPDs for grass-fed that I'm familiar with. So I'll just talk a little bit about our general layout. We kept the finishers on the main farm, which was 100 acres. It was divided into like 24 paddocks, and there was water towards the bottom of pretty much every paddock. And then we would rotate every day, and it was like Rich's uh, photo of that hilly pasture, but it was not as narrow. It was much wider than that. So we would do strip grazing, like 3 days of strip grazing on those paddocks, which were about 3 to 4 acres, about 4 acres each on average. And so we started out, it was old unfertilized hayland and some cornfields, and we basically put the cattle on there and rotated them. And we had one animal per 3 acres in the beginning, and then we got it to basically one animal per acre after several years. I found that the fastest way to get crappy pasture into great pasture was to do bale grazing in the winter on the pasture and move the bales around. And they could trash out the area around the bales some, to make it kind of a little bit muddy. But if they turned it from kind of mushy to soup, that was not good. That area would not come back the next year. But so moving where they were being fed in the winter was I mean, rotational grazing, summer grazing improves pasture over time, but the turnaround on pasture quality from bale grazing is just like a sight to behold. Um, I mean, my neighbors would always like tell me they would know which fields with the bale grazing was because they could see the change in the quality of the grass even the next season. So I'm a big fan of bale grazing. Um, And I'm a big fan of testing of hay also, because a lot of the hay we were not making hay, so we were purchasing hay. There's a lot of not so good hay around for sale, and uh, the only way you're going to really be sure is to test. And if you have a decent sized herd, we had like averaging about 200 animals, uh, and we were buying a lot of hay. It was expensive. So eventually we came to testing all the hay before we purchased it. And that meant schlepping out there and doing sampling on uh, somebody's round bales, often not that close to home farm. Or eventually, if we trusted people, we would have them do the testing and send us the results. And then, make purchases based on the quality of the hay. So we would get, the quality of the winter feed is hugely important if you're trying to get weight gain in the winter. And Rich mentioned wind breaks, also hugely important. I mean, cold is a problem, somewhat of a problem, but cold and wind is really a problem in terms of weight gain. We would start rotating. We were very high up. We were like 2,300 feet. So we would really be May, like the second or third week, mid-May almost until we had real grass. But we would start rotating them around in late April, and just move them really quickly. I mean, we wouldn't divide the paddock into three. We would just leave that big 4 acre paddock open, leave them out there one day with bales, and just have them be eating a combination of bales and grass, and then just rotate them very quickly through the farm. Um, and then we would try to graze as late as possible. I'll talk about that a little more in terms of cost savings, but try to get grazing until at least mid-November. And if I had more land, I would have been grazing them um, into December if possible. So I'm going to talk about just a few just models for how to think about profit, cost, profit. Um, so this is a model with this assumption we're buying or having either buying or producing a calf, and this calf is going to be 650 pounds in the spring. So that's going to mean late summer or fall calving. And we're aiming for a 1,200 pound finishing weight. So if you buy calves, if you if you have a wean calf in the spring, which would mean it was born in the summer, late summer or fall, um, then you're only going to have, if you're going to finish an animal 2 years, you're only going to have one winter of feeding. So that's one very good way of lowering your costs and increasing your profitability. The problem, of course, is most calving happens around here happens in the spring. So you have to kind of redo your calving time and deal with small calves in the winter. Uh, or you find a sale of grass-fed calves that are available in the spring. Um, so on this assumption, you have a 400 grazing days, so it's 2 seasons of grazing and 165 one season of hay feeding days, figuring about a 61%. It's going to be 60, 61 is our average of hanging weight compared to live weight. So you're going to have a 732-pound hanging weight carcass. So where does that cost come from? And this is going to vary from farm to farm, a lot, or not a lot, but some, enough to be meaningful. So in our area, pasture is pretty cheap. I'm figuring you could have pasture for $40 an acre. You may spend a little more, a little less. If you have your own pasture, if you have your own land, you're not leasing, then you have to figure out what the cost of having that money in the land as opposed to putting it in the bank or treasury bill or whatever. And so I'm figuring $40 an acre per year. You got 2 years um, on pasture, so the land is 80 bucks. Assigning pasture management costs, labor costs, per animal, that is. It's probably you can do less if the more animals you have, the less it is because there's economies of scale on grazing. It takes not much more time to do rotational grazing for 20 animals than it does for 200 animals. Um, but we're figuring in this model total pasture cost of $320. And on the chart there, you could see that you're doing 2 years of pasture. It's still less expensive to have the animal on pasture for 2 years than it is to pay for one season of winter. And then there's labor and minerals. So yeah, grazing, this is obvious, but it's like I can't emphasize this enough that grazing is way cheaper than hay. And grazing days is going to be about 80 cents a day per head, maybe even less. A hay day is like, 200, at least $2.50 a day. So extending the grazing season will save you money. I mean, probably we need more study of what the quality of forage is after it's been frozen a few times. Uh, Troy Bishop did some at his farm, did some late season, late November, early December forage samples, and the forage samples, the results were quite good and comparable to what you would be looking for in good hay. So given the numbers I was working with, every extra month of grazing saves you about 50 bucks. So it actually, it pays um, to have more land. It's actually cheaper to buy more land than it is to buy hay. Although, yeah. So, and if you could extend your season for 60 days, that's saving you 100 bucks given this model. So this is about selling, or if you have a cow calf operation, does it make more sense for you to sell calves than to finish them? And given the price that calves are at now, I think it's an important question for the cow calf person. Um, and it's also an important question for the finishing person because you have to buy the calves at the high price. And so it may make sense for the finisher to be having a cow-calf operation also because they'll end up with a calf at a lower cost that they can then finish. So the horizontal dotted line, that's what you're going to get for a calf at market, regardless of the finished beef price. That's, like a 650 pound animal. This is profit based on a model for what it costs to have the cow-calf operation, but you would have about $800 profit from selling the calves. If you finish the calves, then the higher um, the higher the price you're selling them for, obviously you're going to make more. But at some point, the two lines cross. So at about $4.50 a pound for finished beef, if you have a cow-calf operation and then calves to finish, you be at a break-even point. So everything you make over that, it makes sense to finish the animals compared to just selling the calves. On the other hand, if you're going to market and buying those calves, which are now ridiculously expensive, it's hard to make a profit um, unless you're out over $5 a pound at sale price. This is more on heydays reducing cost. This one simply shows the y-axis is the cost per finished animal as a function of the winter feeding days. So, if you can do 140 days, it's going to cost you like $670 to finish the animal versus if you have 160 days, it's going to be over like $725 to finish the animal. So this compares similar to that other one with the lines intersecting, the profit of selling the calf versus raising and finishing the calf on farm. If you're selling your grass finished beef at 490 a pound hanging weight, you might be getting more or less. I don't know. But if you're doing that, then it makes sense for you to raise and finish the calves that you're raising, raise the calves and finish them in the same farm. If you're buying the calf and finishing it, then the profitability is way less at current prices. It's not zero, but it's substantially less. That's again buying in the spring a calf that was born in the fall. So just to review just some of the points about the finishing numbers, um, the grass finishing works best currently, given the current prices. If calves are raised on the farm, the grazing season is long, and hay feeding days are minimized. And the key drivers are feeder calf price, grazing season length, and finished beef price. Um, yeah, so that's it. Um, I'm happy to field any questions or any comments about my numbers or
Do you have any information on your mortality rates?
yeah, so that model had like a 90 on the calf model, it had like a 92% yield on a bred cow, including non-pregnancy and including failure of the pregnancy and death of the calf. So that's maybe a little better than most people get, but that's what I worked with.
And I have a question, and maybe you have a better sense of what the market accepts or tolerates. Um, there are some people that want to supplement their grass finishing with something like molasses or other things that aren't technically a grain. What are your thoughts on that? Do some markets tolerate or accept that?
Well, it's a really interesting question because, the USDA, backed off its clear rules about grass finishing. So if you are making a raising claim, we have labels that are USDA approved. So if you're going to put a label that says how you're raising the animals, it needs to be legally, it needs to be approved by the USDA. So if you're claiming grass-fed, the label has to include what that means. Uh, so if you say grass-fed, um, you know, if you say only grass-fed, then you can't have molasses. But if you say that there's grass-fed for X number of months, you could say that. Or you could say grass-fed and other. I'm not sure what they're going to require, honestly. It's the USDA FSIS. If you're giving molasses and you want to put a label on it, a USDA approved label, you would probably have to say there's molasses being used or like other nutritional sources. On the other hand, if you're selling directly to a buyer and you're not don't have a USDA label on there, then you have more flexibility and then it's based on your communication with your buyer and how transparent you feel you should be, which my feeling is you should be very transparent, but um but the rules about labeling at a or our animals go through a USDA inspected processor in order to be sold to places where they're selling at retail. That's the law. And if we want to make raising claims and put that on the label, then the USDA has to approve that. So we have to submit an affidavit on every animal that goes in. I mean, the oversight is, I would say, lax at best. They're not sending people out to do inspections, but they are requiring an affidavit on all the animals on how they were raised, the details, and so it is, a felony to to lie on the affidavit. But I'm sure it goes on. I mean, it doesn't go on in my world, but in the world it goes on. Did that?
I've got a question. Um, you mentioned spending time, um, looking at carcasses.
Yeah.
Sort of, if you're direct marketing, what do you think is, so people who are direct marketing are not getting a grade on their cattle. It's not, nobody's telling them if it's choice or select or whatever.
Yeah.
What's the best way you think to get data on what your carcasses, how they're finishing? And what's your experience of what people want? Do they want sort of mid-choice, select? What are you shooting for? What do you think people want?
I mean, it depends on the customer. I think when you're dealing with uh, butcher shops, they need a certain visual in order to sell it. They're not looking for the butcher shops that are selling grass-fed, they're not looking for a prime steak, but they're looking for some marbling and some fat cover. And in order to age it properly, you really need some fat cover so it doesn't just dry out. So I would say you're looking for at least low choice for that context. If you're looking for direct to consumer, I think people are going to vary a lot. I think in general, they don't care as much as somebody who's got to put it in a butcher case and have the customer want to buy it. They're looking for a certain look at that kind of the retail. Even in the retail store, we sell a lot to a buyer who gets everything broken down into individual butcher cuts, cryovac, and they're much less sensitive to the finish on the animals. They're looking for like a level of um, of tenderness and flavor. I mean, my sense is that the correlation between marbling and tenderness is not as strong as people like to think. If you look at the literature, it's not that strong, number one. Number two, to get a lot of marbling in a grass-fed animal, they tend to be older. So youth is correlated with tenderness at least as much as marbling is. So, if you're going to try to market an animal at 24 months versus 36 months, it's easier to get a marbled animal at 36 months. It's really easy to get a marbled animal at 5 years, but that's not what most people want to eat. Or where most of those animals are not going to be so tender. So the older they are, the less tender they are. So I think, in terms of talking about like freezer trade direct to consumers, I think people are less sensitive to marbling. But, it's something you could ask the customer. If the customer wants some marbling, that's the one you send them the marbled animal to. I mean, in terms of getting access to I mean, no, our animals they're not graded officially by the USDA. It's just like me seeing them and knowing what the various grades are. I mean, grading is just a visual inspection of the ribeye. That's all it is. So anybody can do that if you just teach yourself how to, get yourself the book of what the different grades look like and compare the ribeye on the carcass to what that is, and then you can do your own grading. Um, you could have, if you're not going to be going to the slaughterhouse or don't have the kind of relationship with the processor where you can walk into the cooler and look at your animals that are hanging there, you could ask them to take a picture of the fat cover and of the ribeye. I don't think it'll put them out very much. Now that everybody's got a phone camera, it'll take them a couple of seconds to do that. And then you'll know what you're going to be getting before it shows up, cut up.
Thanks.
Hey Ken, thanks for doing this presentation. I've learned a lot, and thanks Rich as well for what you did at the beginning. Um, I'm just, like I said at the beginning, I am just starting out. I'm not even sure if I want to do beef at this point. I don't know if I have the land base for it. Rich and Dale have been at my farm, but I'm also in Meredith. I'm just off Turnpike, and I believe you know my mother-in-law, Helene Haining.
Oh,
But
sure.
yeah, who I just wanted to ask, like, if you had 100 acres and we're just starting out, and like, what mistakes did you make in your early days when you were green and naive and optimistic, like I probably am now? Um, and like, who were some of your mentors and key people that you learned from when you were getting started?
There was like nobody in Meredith doing rotational grazing at all. So I just went to grazing conferences and learned from that and looked at a lot of and read a lot of stuff. In 2003, there was not much even online that was particularly good. Um, so, and then rotational grazing is not rocket science. It seriously is not. I mean, it requires observation and paying attention, but I mean, compared to getting the right breeding stock, it's easy. You know, you have to be there and you have to put in a good system in terms of the fencing and the watering system, but that's, I went read a lot of stuff about it and went to conferences and then just sort of adapted that to my farm. Um, I don't think that is that hard. I didn't come from a farming background at all. I went to a cattle handling seminar in Orange in Ulster County where they just, basically showed us the basics of handling cattle, and that was like super helpful. Um, but then there's the question of finding the customers. So, it depends on what your goals are. I mean, if you want to, if you feel, I think there is still room for expansion and freezer trade. I think you could, if you have access to locally. I mean, Delaware County's got like 40 something thousand people. So, you know, I think I don't know how much more room there is for freezer trade if you're selling in Delaware County, because I think that still the demand for grass-fed beef, if it's at much of a premium, is kind of limited. So if you're talking about, 1% of the market in Delaware, I mean 10% of the market in Delaware County, it's like 40 animals are going to be sold to those 40,000 people. If you're talking about New York City, it's 100,000 animals potentially if it's 10% of the market. So it's like a really different scale. But then it's a question of getting customers in New York City and getting the beef there. I mean, I sometimes joke it's easier to put a man on the moon than to get beef delivered to New York City. And that's only a small exaggeration. Yeah.
Yeah, I used to buy your beef at Park Slope Food Co-op.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I
so
mean, we have a relationship with Regional Access, and they pick up at this processor and bring it down to New York every week. If it wasn't for them, we'd be completely out of business. I don't have another option that's going to be consistent and reliable to do that. So I didn't even talk about that. But if you're, going if you're going a distance, but if somebody wanted my beef from Philadelphia, I wouldn't know how to get it there.
thanks, Ken.
And have you or anyone looked into retail models? Because in New York City, no one has freezers. I'm constantly told at Union Square that they got about a shoebox size of
Yeah.
where the beef, so the whole model of a quarter cow. I have dozens that talk about it, but I haven't sold one yet because they can't come up with an answer.
Yeah. So
So
then you're about retailing it, but that means going to a farmer's market, right?
or there's a lot of things popping up now you hear them on the radio, beef producers, boy, I can't get them. Uh, WABC has one that's always advertising for farm raised beef. And so they're on the radio, but I didn't know if anything had been pursued.
Right. So there have been, and maybe some of them will succeed. There have been, um, home delivery models that have come and gone. They generally knew somebody in the finance world and they sort of like pitched it and they got some funding and they did it for a few years and then folded. I'm not saying it's not going to work out. Eventually, probably the demand will be there or they'll figure it out. But it's so that means you're talking about this basically a company that's doing home delivery. Is that what?
I think they're shipping it. I don't know. wish I had written down their name, that there were two of them advertising for Christmas.
Sort of
Okay.
like Omaha Steaks or those kind of places.
Yeah, but they were pitching it as farm, family farm.
Right, yes.
Ranchers, uh, ranchers.com or something like that.
Yeah, maybe. I'm not saying it won't work, and I think, the the problem that ha existed so far uh, was when you start disaggregating the animal instead of like selling wholes, halves, or quarters. When you really start breaking it down into the component parts, you have to move everything at a consistent speed, all the cuts. So that's from the point of view, I mean, from the point of view of the farmer, if they're buying the whole animal from you, no problem. And then it's their problem how to disaggregate it and sell it all. But to have a sustained business model for the company, they need to be able to move everything at a consistent rate. And that's been a real mountain that people have not been able to climb. The one that surprised me the most was Dolan Bailey, which for a few years they were buying a good number of grass finished animals, and they were like a multi-generation Boston old school meat purveyor, with a huge cutting set up downstairs, and upstairs like a room full of 30 people on the phone selling meat to people that they've had relationships with for like 50 years, and still couldn't move the ground beef because there was so much ground beef that, coming off of the animal. I mean, and they had relationships with wholesale buyers like schools, et cetera, and they couldn't ultimately make it work. They tried. I thought they were very committed. So it's a tough problem. I'm not saying it's not solvable, but it's a really tough problem to solve. And there's no doubt that whoever rancher.com is, if they're buying from farmers, um, they're going to have a similar challenge. Maybe they'll meet the challenge. I don't know. There was one company that was, I'm blocking on the name, and um, their model was the farmer was at risk. They were taking the animals, and if they didn't sell the whole thing, they sent it back to you. So you, instead of them being stuck with 150 pounds of ground beef per animal that they couldn't sell, you got stuck with 150 pounds of animal that they couldn't sell, right? But on the other hand, again, if they're buying it and they're paying, then I'm not sure how long it's going to last, but why not, right?
Well, on my individual basis, I guess I just have the right place, because I don't, I can get rid of anything. Ground beef is the easiest thing for me to get rid of,
Yeah.
but it's probably because of the individual face-to-face market.
Yeah. Are you at a market that you do that?
Union Square.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there you have a lot of customers, and you probably have a really good product, plus you're the product.
Yeah,
Yeah. But they limit the number of meat sellers at Union Square, don't they?
right. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a ton of people, and you have a certain amount of protection against competition. I'm not saying total protection, but a certain amount. But then you have to go to Union Square, and that's a big commitment, right? Time,
Yeah.
got to
Long day.
drive a long way, set up, stand outside, and pack up and bring back home what you did or didn't sell. I mean, there are some farmers markets that are closer, but the scale of the customer base is way smaller.
Well, there's time for one more question. Do you have any online?
No, any here?
If not, we can thank Ken for a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you all. This was fun.